You think you're being bullied by your mom, but it's all in your head. Mom is just teaching you how to be a proper daughter-in-law. You're so good at not playing the victim." These were the words my husband Steve said when I told him about the harassment from my mother-in-law, Pamela. Pamela throws away the meals I make and drops the laundry I hung out on the ground. To Steve, that seems like educating a daughter-in-law. Seeing me speechless, Steve just laughed mockingly and then said something unbelievable. "My name is Laura. I'm 28 and work as an office worker at a pharmaceutical company. Steve was a college friend and we got married 3 years ago. I lost my parents around the same time I graduated from college. It was so sudden, and as an only child, I felt doomed to a lifetime of loneliness. My parents didn't have much interaction with relatives, so mostly their acquaintances and friends attended the funeral. Without time to grieve, I started working at the company where I was hired as a new grad and met Steve through a friend. Out of pity for me losing my parents, Steve often took me to his parents' house. From the beginning of our relationship, his parents welcomed me like their own daughter, and I never doubted our good relationship even after marriage, often enjoying my mother-in-law's cooking. I wanted to continue working even after having children. If I couldn't leave our future children at daycare, there would be no one to help me with parenting since I lost my parents. When I shared this concern with Steve, he said Pamela would take care of it, and things went smoothly. I ended up living with Pamela at my in-laws' house. My father-in-law was away on a job assignment, so it was just me, Steve, and Pamela living there. Things were fine at first, but after 3 years of living with my in-laws and not being able to conceive, Pamela's attitude towards me changed noticeably. She would say, "Laura, how many times do I have to tell you? You're the youngest in this house, so you should do the housework." On weekends, Pamela would always push her cleaning and laundry onto me. Even though I was living in their house and doing most of the household chores, Pamela just didn't seem to like me. She would purposefully drop my freshly laundered clothes in the yard and dirty the washed dishes, making me wash them again. She constantly nagged me over trivial things and lectured me about not being able to provide grandchildren. I was already feeling broken inside, and Steve's lack of understanding made it worse. I repeatedly told Steve about Pamela's harassment and insults, but his response was always, "You're imagining things, overthinking it." At that time, Pamela never harassed me in front of Steve, so maybe he couldn't believe his mother would do such awful things. But even without that, Steve's attitude was unacceptable. It was as if Pamela was the victim and I was the villain, making me realize I had no allies in my in-laws' house. Once Steve showed he didn't believe me, Pamela's harassment intensified. What used to be done behind Steve's back now happened even in front of him. Verbal abuse and harassment finally became constant. I became pregnant around this time, but even as the tough period of morning sickness passed and I entered a stable phase, my heart wasn't light. Going on maternity leave and being constantly subjected to Pamela's relentless harassment, with Steve not only disbelieving me but joining Pamela in belittling me, were the main reasons. Even Steve, who was so happy when he first found out about the pregnancy, now joined Pamela in calling me a woman who does nothing but eat and sleep. I knew stress was bad for the baby, but I saw no solution. Despite the situation, the only person I could turn to for help was Steve. I decided to have a serious talk with him, recounting all the mistreatment from Pamela and hoping for a change in his attitude for the sake of our unborn child. I picked a weekend and approached Steve while he was relaxing in the living room. "Hey, There's something I want to talk about, I said. Steve lazily lifted his face from his phone. Lately, both you and Pamela have been really cruel to me. When Pamela harasses me, you just ignore it and pretend it's not happening. Can you stop doing that? Steve, seemingly unsure whether to listen or not, stared blankly into the distance. Then he mockingly focused back on me. That's just you overreacting. What Mom does isn't harassment or anything. How can you say that? Throwing away the food I make without touching it, deliberately littering my room, isn't that harassment? Maybe Mom is just trying to educate you to be a proper daughter-in-law. Why can't you understand that? Steve's words made my vision blur with disbelief. I unconsciously placed my hand on my stomach and looked down. There was no way I could raise a child in this awful house. Steve and Pamela's mindset would definitely have a bad influence on the child. Maybe it's normal for you and Pamela, but it's hard for me. I'm at my limit. My hand on my stomach trembled slightly. My anguished cry tore through me, but it didn't reach Steve. All that came back was his mocking laughter. At my breaking point, Steve said, "If it's so bad, why don't you leave? Neither Mom nor I would be troubled by your absence." Steve's unexpected suggestion stopped my thoughts for a moment. "What are you saying? I'm pregnant, you know." Steve looked at me as if to say, "So what?" and let out a dry laugh. "Ha, that's right. You have nowhere to go if you're kicked out. Poor thing. With no parents or a home to return to, you have no place to rely on." Steve's mocking voice echoed in my ears. I bit my lip and glared at him with anger in my eyes. What's with that look? Overwhelmed by my intense gaze, Steve looked slightly displeased. "I'm going back to my parents' home," I said after a moment of silence. Steve burst out laughing. "Go back if you can. You'll probably end up sleeping on the streets. Talking big about going back to your parents' home." As Steve's laughter continued, I pulled out a large Boston bag from the closet and started packing clothes and valuables. Steve seemed to believe I had no place to go other than his parents' house. He thought that even if I said I would leave out of stubbornness, I'd ultimately have no choice but to return. Pamela, hearing the conversation, came over and said, "It's your fault for not following our house's rules." Like Steve, Pamela seemed to be saying I should leave if I didn't like it. I had no intention of ever returning to my in-laws' house. Once I settled down after leaving, I planned to send divorce papers. After packing, I muttered to Steve and Pamela, who were still laughing unpleasantly, goodbye. I had decided then to raise this child on my own. They would never see the face of my unborn child. A year has passed since I left the in-laws' house. I successfully gave birth to a girl and, despite struggling with parenting alone, I haven't returned. 3 months after leaving, I sent Steve divorce papers, which were processed without issue. I also requested child support, but Steve hasn't paid. So it seems I'll need to talk to a lawyer and negotiate with him in the future, trying to lift my sinking spirits. I looked up at the towering high-rise in front of me. A sign saying "Model Room Open for Viewing" stood at the entrance, and occasionally other visitors came to look around. I was thinking of buying a condo before returning to work. Where I'm living now is far from both my workplace and the nearest childcare center, making it inconvenient. Considering I'll be raising my child alone, I want to settle down in a fixed place soon. Fortunately, I have ample funds to buy a condo. After registering at the reception on the first floor, I was shown to a room on the top floor. Following the guide, I rode the elevator up. Arriving at the 50th floor, the elevator doors opened, and I was surprised. The person I saw was just as shocked to see me. The employee assigned to guide me turned out to be Steve. He was supposed to be working at a securities firm when we were married. But when did he switch jobs? Steve must have never imagined meeting me here. Clearly unsettled, he started darting his gaze around. Moreover, this was the top floor of an exclusive apartment, accessible only to those with a serious intention to buy. With an awkward smile, Steve began showing me around the top floor. His words were gentle, but his glances kept asking why I was there. We both felt uncomfortable, but the room itself was impeccable. It was close to my workplace and had an underground connection to a childcare center. As expected of a luxury high-rise, it boasted a park in the courtyard and a 24-hour supermarket underground. An ideal environment where I could definitely raise my child on my own. "I think I'll take this apartment," I said. Steve was surprised at my decision. I had come prepared to sign a contract immediately if I found a suitable place. However, Steve didn't bring out the contract, no matter how long I waited. Just as I was about to question him, Steve's lips quivered. "There's no way. What? A single mom going through a divorce can't afford the top floor of a high-rise?" Steve's face showed a mix of emotions. His expression, neither anger nor jealousy, seemed accusatory. "Did you catch some rich guy, or are you doing some unspeakable job?" I stepped back as he closed in. "No, I just sold my family home for a bit more than expected." "Your family home?" Steve asked. I recounted the events of the past year. After leaving my in-laws, I moved back to my family home, which was in my name. Both my parents had passed, and the house was too large for me alone. The impressive water garden, a hobby of my father's, must have added to its value. Just before the baby was born, someone wanted to buy it. But that doesn't mean it would sell for enough to buy the top floor of a mansion, right? Steve's skepticism was understandable. The house was old and showing wear. I thought it would only cover living expenses for a while, but the buyer was a well-known wealthy individual. He was more interested in the water garden than the house itself, offering 5 times the market value for it. I explained that the garden was a hobby, not professionally landscaped, and that I barely maintained it. However, the buyer liked the foundation and planned to hire a gardener to reshape it to his liking. His willingness to pay so much, even after seeing its current state, led me to sell the house. He even added a living allowance to the price, as he felt bad for buying me out. This allowed me to live nearby in an apartment, focusing on childcare without financial worries. Hearing my story, Steve's eyes sparkled briefly. Then his attitude changed, and he humbly apologized. "I'm sorry about what happened. Can we start over?" Confidence oozed from Steve's face, as if he was sure I wouldn't refuse. But I didn't take his offered hand. "I can raise my child and live well without you. I have no desire to live with someone who looks down on others." At that moment, Steve's face turned to anger. His face reddened as he glared at me. "You're refusing my offer to remarry you?" A colleague with the contract appeared behind Steve, perhaps curious about our long conversation. I glanced past Steve to greet the colleague, but Steve seemed oblivious. "A woman being rich is just wrong. Women should just quietly support their men and stay at home," Steve said. The colleague's face went pale. I silenced his attempt to intervene with a look. "Is that all you wanted to say? So you think you can look down on me now that you're rich? You were better off as a lifetime servant in your husband's house." I sighed and turned to the employee standing frozen with a stack of contracts and documents. "I can't make a big purchase from a company that employs someone who talks like this." At my words, Steve finally turned around. The employee, realizing he was being addressed, rushed over and effusively apologized, almost scattering the documents in his haste. "I'm so sorry. My subordinate was incredibly rude to you. Come on, you apologize too," he urged his boss. Steve seemed to finally grasp that things were going badly. He apologized repeatedly, along with his boss. "Please stop," I commanded. The two instantly looked up. "I won't buy it anyway. I'm sorry. I'll look at other apartments." Their expressions turned to despair at my words. "Wait, I take back everything I said. Just sign this contract. Do you really think I'd make a deal that benefits you after all you said?" Steve looked defeated. The outcome was clear. It was a loss for Steve, who knew nothing but to look down on others, and the boss, who probably hoped that our being ex-spouses would smooth things over. Hearing Steve's pathetic state, I didn't feel much sympathy. I liked everything about the apartment, its location, its layout, but it couldn't be helped. I didn't want to spend my money at a company with such people. Leaving them, I bowed and left the room. No one saw me off as I rode the elevator alone out of the building. I didn't look back as I walked away, searching for another model apartment. Later, I heard through Pamela that Steve had not only lost the big contract for the top floor of the high-rise, but also faced a pay cut and demotion for his verbal abuse towards me, a client, leading to his resignation. After resigning, Steve struggled to find another job, resorting to alcohol and gambling, with Pamela taking care of him. I once met Pamela at the supermarket. "My son isn't working and stays at home, taking his anger out on me. I'm sorry for everything. Please remarry him and come back," she pleaded. I quickly responded, "Why don't you leave the house if it's so bad?" Pamela's face fell in despair, and I felt a slight sense of relief. I purchased an apartment in a different building and returned to work after putting my child in childcare. The money from selling my family home was more than enough to raise my child. But I loved my job and was asked to return, so I did. With a recent promotion, I'm now living a fulfilling life, juggling work and childcare,